The allegations came fast, loud, and without mercy. One day BJ Whittaker was a name whispered on the edges of comment sections, and the next she was painted as the central villain in a family collapse that had been decades in the making. Abuse. Manipulation. Control. The words stacked up until they started sounding like facts, even when no one could clearly say where they came from. And for a long time, BJ stayed quiet. Not because she didn't hear them, but because she knew how these stories work. Once a narrative takes hold, silence is treated like guilt and speaking up is treated like proof you were hiding something all along. But silence has a breaking point. BJ has lived most of her life inside chaos, not observing it from the outside, but surviving it in real time. Addiction, instability, fractured relationships, and the constant judgment of people who only know pieces of her story have shaped her long before the Whittaker family ever went viral. When she entered their lives again, she didn't walk into a blank slate. She walked into a family already under a microscope, already fractured by poverty, disability, and decades of neglect that had nothing to do with her. Yet somehow, when everything exploded, BJ became the easiest target. What rarely gets mentioned is how quickly blame shifted. When donors started asking questions. When promises fell apart. When pressure mounted on people who had positioned themselves as saviors. Suddenly, there needed to be a reason everything went wrong, and BJ's past made her convenient. It didn't matter that no formal findings named her as an abuser. It didn't matter that allegations appeared only after other routes failed. The story had already been written for her. BJ watched as strangers debated her character as if it were a public resource. People who had never shared a meal with her, never sat across from her during withdrawal, never seen her protect someone she loved with nothing but instinct and stubborn loyalty, spoke with certainty about who she was. They talked about her like she was an idea, not a person. And that distance made cruelty easy. The hardest part wasn't being criticized. BJ is used to that. The hardest part was watching how the accusations were used to fracture the family further. Allegations didn't just isolate her, they turned relatives against one another, redirected anger away from uncomfortable questions, and gave outsiders a villain simple enough to explain a very complicated collapse. And once that happened, no one wanted nuance anymore. BJ is not claiming innocence in every part of her life. She has never pretended to be perfect. She has acknowledged addiction. She has admitted to mistakes. She has owned harm where harm was real. But what she refuses to accept is being rewritten into a monster to protect other people's reputations. Especially when those same people benefited from her presence when it was convenient. One detail that keeps getting buried is this: BJ showed up when others didn't. She cooked. She cleaned. She stayed. When holidays came and went with silence from extended family, she was there. When Thanksgiving arrived and no one else stepped in, BJ made dinner for Betty. That fact alone doesn't make her a hero, but it does complicate the narrative. Monsters don't usually show up for quiet, unglamorous work. They don't stay when there's nothing to gain. BJ noticed something else too. The allegations against her only became loud when she started asking questions. When she didn't move fast enough. When she didn't play dumb. When she showed awareness in rooms where awareness made others uncomfortable. She wasn't easy to manage, and in families like this, being difficult often gets reframed as being dangerous. She watched how words were weaponized. Abuse, repeated often enough that people stopped asking for evidence. Threat, used broadly enough that it could mean anything. And once adult protective services entered the conversation, the story hardened. Few people stopped to ask why previous attempts had failed. Few people questioned why allegations appeared when they did. Fewer still asked who benefited most from BJ being removed from the picture entirely. BJ is especially clear about one point. There has never been proof that she physically abused anyone in the Whittaker family. Not one verified report. Not one substantiated finding made public. What exists are allegations layered on top of assumptions, amplified by people with platforms, and repeated until they felt undeniable. And once that happened, defending herself became almost impossible. Any denial was framed as manipulation. Any explanation was framed as deflection. She also knows how addiction is used against people. Once the word addict enters the conversation, everything else gets filtered through it. Addiction becomes shorthand for moral failure, violence, and intent, even when none of those things are present. BJ doesn't deny her addiction. She denies the idea that addiction automatically makes her abusive, cruel, or incapable of care. Another truth rarely acknowledged is how the family dynamic actually functioned. The Whittakers were never a stable unit suddenly disrupted by BJ's arrival. They were a fragile system surviving through routine, avoidance, and silence. BJ didn't create the cracks. She stepped into them. And when pressure finally shattered the structure, it was easier to blame the newest, loudest, least palatable piece than to confront decades of systemic failure. BJ also understands why some people wanted her gone. Her presence complicated the story. As long as she was there, it was harder to present a clean narrative of helpless victims and heroic outsiders. She knew too much. She spoke too freely. She didn't always say the right thing. And in a situation where control over the story meant control over money, sympathy, and blame, unpredictability was a threat. She watched as people she once trusted distanced themselves publicly while staying quiet privately. She watched accusations grow more dramatic the further she was pushed out. And she watched supporters turn into judges overnight, convinced they were protecting the family by erasing her from it. BJ isn't asking to be loved. She isn't asking to be forgiven by strangers. What she is asking for is honesty. Honesty about timelines. Honesty about motives. Honesty about who made which decisions and why. She wants people. Turning BJ into the villain didn't save them. It didn't protect them. It just gave everyone somewhere easier to look. BJ knows that fighting back comes with risks. Speaking now means reopening wounds. It means inviting more scrutiny. But staying silent only allows a false version of events to harden permanently. And she refuses to let that happen, especially when the truth is messier, more uncomfortable, and far more human than the version being sold. There is a difference between accountability and scapegoating. BJ is willing to face the first. She will not accept the second. And as this story continues to unfold, one question hangs in the air, heavier than all the accusations combined. If BJ was truly the danger everyone claims, why did the family rely on her when no one else showed up? And if she wasn't, who needed her to be? What do you think about the way BJ has been portrayed versus what's actually been proven? Leave your thoughts in the comments. The moment BJ decided to speak, the story shifted in a way many people weren't prepared for. Not because her words erased the allegations, but because they forced a harder question into the open. What if the version everyone accepted was incomplete by design? BJ didn't come forward with dramatic denials or polished statements. What she offered instead was something far more uncomfortable: context. She began by addressing the timeline, because timelines are where stories either hold together or fall apart. The loudest accusations against her did not surface at the beginning of the crisis. They appeared later, after other explanations failed to stick. After money questions. After partnerships collapsed. After pressure mounted on people who had promised stability and delivered none. BJ noticed that pattern early, even if others didn't want to see it. She talked about how quickly concern turned into condemnation. One week she was being thanked for helping Betty navigate daily life. The next, she was being described as a threat who needed to be removed immediately. There was no gradual escalation, no documented incident that explained the shift. Just a sudden consensus that she was dangerous. BJ doesn't deny that she is flawed. What she denies is the idea that danger appeared overnight without evidence. BJ also addressed the accusation that hurt her the most: abuse. She spoke carefully, not because she was afraid, but because she understood the gravity of the word. Abuse is not something to argue lightly. It leaves scars. It deserves investigation. And that is exactly why she insists on one fact that keeps getting overlooked. No finding has ever confirmed that she physically abused anyone in that household. No report has been released showing substantiated violence. Allegations were made, repeated, and accepted, but never tested publicly. She explained how those allegations became a tool. When earlier attempts to involve adult protective services didn't result in removal, something changed. The narrative escalated. Suddenly the language became more extreme. Abuse replaced neglect. Urgency replaced concern. BJ believes that shift wasn't about new information. It was about results. Another point BJ raised was how her addiction was framed. She does not minimize it. She calls it what it is: destructive, exhausting, and something she continues to battle. But she also refuses the idea that addiction automatically equals abuse. In her words, addiction explains behavior, not character. And using it as proof of cruelty is not protection, it's prejudice. She talked about how addiction made her hyper-aware, not careless. When you live on the margins, you learn to read rooms quickly. You learn when people are lying, when stories don't add up, when decisions are being rushed for reasons that have nothing to do with safety. BJ believes that awareness is what made her a problem for some people. She asked questions. She noticed inconsistencies. She didn't always stay quiet. BJ described moments where she felt pressure to fall in line, to agree publicly with versions of events she didn't believe, to stop talking to certain people, to stop asking why. And when she didn't comply, the temperature changed. She went from being tolerated to being targeted, from helpful to harmful, from inconvenient to dangerous. She also addressed the theft accusations. Yes, she admitted she stole. She didn't dance around it. She didn't minimize it. Addiction drove her to make choices she regrets deeply. But she drew a line between theft and abuse, between harm caused by desperation and harm caused by cruelty. She owned one without accepting responsibility for the other. BJ spoke about how quickly nuance disappears once a crowd decides who the villain is. Every action gets reinterpreted. Every past mistake gets reframed as proof of present danger. And every attempt to explain becomes manipulation. She said it felt like being tried without a courtroom, sentenced without evidence, and silenced without appeal. One of the most painful parts for her was how family relationships were weaponized. Private conflicts became public leverage. Old arguments were dragged into new contexts. People who had once defended her stayed silent, not because they believed she was guilty, but because it was safer. BJ doesn't blame them entirely. Fear spreads faster than truth. She also talked about Betty, carefully and respectfully. BJ made it clear that she never saw Betty as someone to control. She saw her as someone overwhelmed, someone who had carried too much for too long. Cooking a meal, helping with routine, being present, those weren't strategies. They were what you do when someone is struggling and everyone else is arguing online. BJ rejected the idea that caring for someone automatically means manipulating them. She acknowledged that boundaries were messy, communication imperfect, and stress constant. But she insisted that care and control are not the same thing, even when outsiders collapse them into one. She pointed out another uncomfortable truth. The loudest voices calling for her removal were often the same voices benefiting from her absence. Once BJ was gone, certain narratives became easier to maintain. Questions stopped. Blame shifted. The story simplified. And simplicity, BJ argues, was the goal all along. BJ also addressed the idea that she caused the family's collapse. She asked people to look honestly at the history. She talked about the psychological toll of being labeled a threat. The fear of knowing that no matter what you say, someone will interpret it as confirmation. The exhaustion of watching strangers decide your intent without ever asking your perspective. BJ admitted there were moments she wanted to disappear entirely, not because she was guilty, but because the weight became unbearable. But disappearing would have meant allowing a false version of events to harden permanently. And BJ refuses that. She knows her past makes her easy to dismiss. She knows some people will never believe her. But she also knows that silence would only protect the people who needed her quiet. BJ ended her statement with something that stuck with many who listened. She said accountability should move in all directions, not just toward the person with the least power. If mistakes were made, they should be examined honestly. If decisions were rushed, motives should be questioned. And if allegations were used strategically, that truth deserves daylight too. She is not asking to be trusted blindly. She is asking for the same scrutiny applied to everyone else. The same demand for evidence. The same refusal to accept convenient stories without proof. BJ knows that fighting back doesn't guarantee vindication. But it does reclaim something that was taken from her early on, her voice. And whether people agree with her or not, she is done allowing others to speak for her while calling it protection. What's your take on BJ's response and the way allegations took shape over time? Share your thoughts in the comments. As BJ's response circulated, another layer of the story began to surface, one that shifted attention away from individual accusations and toward the environment that allowed them to spread unchecked. This wasn't just about whether BJ was guilty or innocent. It was about how easily narratives form when fear, power imbalance, and public spectacle collide. People started asking why the loudest claims were accepted so quickly. In most situations involving serious allegations, there is a process: documentation, interviews, corroboration, review. Here, the process seemed inverted. Conclusions came first. Justifications followed later. And once those conclusions took hold, every new detail was filtered through them. BJ pointed out how language played a critical role. Words like unsafe, volatile, and out of control began appearing everywhere, often without specifics attached. They sounded authoritative, urgent, protective. But when people asked for examples, timelines, or reports, the answers were vague. We can't share details. It's confidential. Trust us. Those phrases became shields against scrutiny. She talked about how fear spreads faster than facts, especially in communities already primed for suspicion. Once one person expresses concern, others feel pressure to agree or risk being labeled irresponsible. Silence becomes complicity. Questions become hostility. And soon, no one remembers where the concern started, only that it exists. BJ also addressed the role of online amplification. Clips were cut, context removed, moments frozen into evidence they were never meant to be. A raised voice became aggression. Frustration became threat. Hesitation became guilt. The internet doesn't tolerate complexity well, and BJ's life was nothing but complex. She described watching strangers debate her character as if it were a puzzle to solve. People who had never met her spoke with certainty about her intentions. They compared notes, shared theories, reinforced each other's assumptions. And with each repetition, speculation hardened into what everyone knows. What troubled BJ most wasn't being misunderstood. It was how quickly misunderstanding turned into justification for action. Once she was labeled a danger, anything done to remove her could be framed as protection. Isolation became safety. Exclusion became care. And no one had to wrestle with the moral discomfort of acting without proof, because the label did the work for them. BJ also reflected on how vulnerability was used selectively. The family's vulnerability mattered when it supported a certain narrative, but not when it complicated it. Their disabilities were highlighted when it justified intervention, but ignored when it raised questions about consent, comprehension, or manipulation by others. Vulnerability became a tool, not a responsibility. She spoke about the double standard applied to behavior. When BJ made mistakes, they were attributed to character. When others made mistakes, they were attributed to stress, confusion, or good intentions gone wrong. Accountability flowed in one direction. Excuses flowed in the other. Another issue BJ raised was timing. She urged people to look closely at when certain allegations surfaced and what was happening simultaneously. Financial disputes, broken partnerships, growing scrutiny, promises that hadn't materialized. Each escalation in accusations seemed to coincide with a moment when someone else needed leverage or deflection. BJ didn't claim a grand conspiracy. She described something more mundane and more dangerous: self-preservation. When people feel threatened, they look for ways to shift focus. And the easiest way to do that is to identify a problem that everyone agrees needs to be removed. She talked about how systems often fail the people they claim to protect. When intervention finally comes, it's rarely clean. It's rushed. It's blunt. And it often prioritizes institutional safety over individual dignity. BJ believes that once the system entered the picture, nuance disappeared entirely. From that point on, decisions weren't about what was true. They were about what was defensible, what could be justified on paper, what minimized risk for agencies, partners, and individuals with influence. And in that calculus, BJ was expendable. She also addressed the emotional aftermath. Being removed from a situation doesn't just end your involvement. It erases your history. Suddenly, everything you did before becomes suspect. Every act of care is reinterpreted. Every conflict is rewritten. You're no longer a participant. You're a liability. BJ spoke candidly about the grief of that erasure. Losing relationships not because they ended naturally, but because they were declared inappropriate. Watching people distance themselves not out of conviction, but out of fear. As more people revisited the timeline, cracks appeared. Statements contradicted earlier claims. Urgency didn't align with history. And the absence of clear documentation became harder to ignore. BJ didn't present this as vindication, but as an invitation to slow down. She urged people to resist the comfort of certainty, to sit with discomfort, to ask why some voices were amplified while others were dismissed, to notice who benefited from the outcome and who paid the price. BJ ended this part of her response by returning to a simple principle: truth doesn't need speed. It needs care. When stories are rushed, they often protect the wrong people. And when accountability is selective, justice becomes theater. She isn't asking for sympathy. She's asking for fairness. The kind that applies pressure evenly. The kind that doesn't collapse under scrutiny. The kind that allows multiple truths to exist at once. Because if this story teaches anything, it's that the most dangerous lies aren't always deliberate. Sometimes they're built from fear, convenience, and silence. And once built, they're very hard to tear down. Do you think the situation was shaped more by fear and urgency than by evidence and process? Share your thoughts in the comments. By the time BJ's full response reached the wider public, the conversation had shifted again. It was no longer just about what she was accused of, or even about whether those accusations could be proven. It became about something deeper and more unsettling. How quickly a person can be transformed into a symbol, and how dangerous that transformation can be when real lives are attached to it. BJ addressed this directly. She said that once she became the problem, everything else fell into place too neatly. Every unresolved tension in the family, every failure by outsiders, every broken promise suddenly had a convenient explanation. If something went wrong, it must trace back to her. That narrative was simple, emotionally satisfying, and easy to repeat. It didn't require uncomfortable questions about money, power, or responsibility. She spoke about how isolation works as punishment long before anyone calls it that. Doors stop opening. Calls go unanswered. People who once defended you grow quiet, not because they've changed their minds, but because staying connected becomes risky. BJ said that silence from others hurt more than the accusations themselves. Silence meant fear had won. One of the hardest points she raised was the idea of selective memory. Moments when she helped were erased. Times she showed up were forgotten. The Thanksgiving dinner she cooked for Betty became an inconvenience to the narrative, not a fact worth acknowledging. Care didn't fit the story people wanted to tell, so it was dismissed as manipulation or ignored entirely. BJ didn't deny her flaws. She spoke openly about her struggles, including addiction and instability, but she challenged the idea that imperfection equals danger. She asked a question that made many uncomfortable. At what point did having problems become the same thing as being a threat? And who gets to decide that line? She pointed out that many of the people judging her had never lived under constant scrutiny, never had their worst moments dissected by strangers, never had their mistakes turned into permanent identities. Accountability, she argued, had been weaponized. Not to correct behavior, but to remove someone from the picture entirely. BJ also turned the focus toward the broader system that allowed this to happen. She talked about how authorities and intermediaries often rely on narratives already circulating rather than starting fresh. When a story is loud enough, it becomes assumed truth. Files are built around it. Decisions are justified by it. And reversing that momentum becomes nearly impossible. She questioned why no one seemed interested in mediation, de-escalation, or support that didn't involve removal and erasure. Why was the solution always separation, always silence, always disappearance? Why was there no room for boundaries instead of banishment? BJ described the emotional toll of being treated as radioactive. She said there's a unique kind of pain that comes from knowing people believe you. She talked about how quickly public attention moves on, but consequences don't. Long after the comments stop and the videos disappear, people are left with fractured relationships, lost homes, and reputations that never fully recover. BJ said she would live with this story for the rest of her life, regardless of how it ended. Another critical point she raised was consent. Who consented to these stories being told? Who agreed to have their lives dissected for public consumption? And who benefited when those stories generated sympathy, donations, and attention? BJ didn't accuse everyone of exploitation, but she insisted that exploitation doesn't require malice. Sometimes it only requires opportunity. She acknowledged that some people genuinely believed they were protecting the family. She doesn't dismiss their concern, but she asked them to consider whether protection that strips people of voice, context, and humanity is protection at all, or whether it's simply control wearing a softer name. BJ emphasized that she wasn't asking to be rehabilitated in the public eye. She wasn't seeking redemption arcs or sympathy campaigns. What she wanted was accuracy, fairness, a willingness to hold space for complexity instead of flattening everything into good versus bad. She also spoke about forgiveness, but not in the way people expect. Forgiveness, she said, doesn't mean pretending harm didn't happen. It means refusing to let harm define every future interaction. It means allowing people to grow without chaining them permanently to their worst chapter. As the dust began to settle, more people started to ask the questions BJ had raised from the beginning. Why did certain voices dominate while others were sidelined? Why were some actions scrutinized and others excused? Why did urgency always seem to point in one direction? BJ didn't claim victory. She said this wasn't a win. It was survival. Speaking out didn't undo what had been done, but it prevented the story from being closed without her in it. She reclaimed her right to be part of the narrative, even if that narrative remained messy. She ended her response with a reminder that families like theirs don't need saviors. They need support that respects autonomy, dignity, and truth. They need systems that listen before acting and communities that question before condemning. Most of all, they need people willing to admit when they might be wrong. Because once allegations harden into certainty without evidence, everyone loses. Trust erodes. Justice becomes selective. And the people caught in the middle are left carrying consequences they didn't create. BJ said the truth doesn't always arrive clean or comfortable. Sometimes it arrives fractured, contested, and incomplete. But that doesn't make it worthless. It makes it human. And she left the audience with one final thought. If we only believe stories that make us feel righteous, we will miss the ones that demand responsibility. Comment below. Do you believe BJ was unfairly targeted? Or do you think the allegations were justified given the circumstances? Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another.